Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Blood Red Moon. The town of Ashford had always been known for its quiet, unassuming charm. Nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense woods, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing ever seemed to happen. But there was one thing about Ashford that everyone avoided talking about: the red moon. Every time the full moon rose crimson in the night sky, the townspeople were struck by a strange, unnerving sense of dread. At first, it was just the nightmares. People would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to shake the vivid, twisted dreams that plagued them during the nights the red moon hung high. Some saw dark, distorted figures creeping at the edges of their vision. Others saw entire towns burning and crumbling to ash. There were whispers of a curse, a long-held secret, but no one ever spoke of it aloud. It was easier to ignore. But for Samantha, it wasn't just the nightmares. It started a few years ago when she was a child. She remembered how the red moon had seemed so bright, almost unnatural, casting a bloody glow over the streets, as if the world itself were bleeding. That night, her grandmother had warned her never to go outside when the moon was red. But as a young girl, Samantha didn't understand why. Now, as an adult, she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But it was only after she returned to Ashford after years away that she began to realize the horrors were more than just dreams. It happened again one night, just like it always did. The full moon was red, painting the sky in shades of crimson and blood. Samantha lay in her bed, but sleep eluded her, as it always did when the red moon came. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something unseen pressed down on the town. She heard the sounds of distant whispers from the street outside, but when she pulled back the curtains, nothing was there. The town was eerily silent, as if it were holding its breath. Then came the nightmares, but these weren't the usual surreal dreams. These were different. This time, she didn't wake up screaming. She didn't just feel afraid. She felt something pulling at her from the edges of the dream, calling her deeper into it. She saw the familiar streets of Ashford, but they were covered in fog. The houses were decayed, falling apart like they had been abandoned for years. The trees that lined the streets were twisted, gnarled, their roots creeping like serpents through the cracked pavement. Samantha walked through the desolate town, her footsteps echoing in the silence. But as she moved deeper into the dream, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure standing in the distance, watching her. It was a man, but he wasn't like any man she had ever seen. His face was gaunt, hollowed out, with skin that seemed to stretch too tightly over his skull. His eyes were wide and empty, black pits of nothingness that seemed to draw her in. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. Her legs refused to move. The man took a step forward and then another, his movements jerky, unnatural. The closer he got, the more his face seemed to melt and distort, like a mask being torn apart. His mouth opened wide in a twisted grin, showing rows of sharp teeth, and then he lunged. Samantha woke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. She scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, her heart racing, but the nightmare still clung to her, like the heavy weight of the air. The same suffocating silence filled the room, and she felt it, the presence of something dark, something waiting. She wasn't sure if it was the lingering fear from the dream or something real, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following night, the red moon rose again. This time, Samantha couldn't stay in bed. She had to know what was happening. The nightmares were becoming too real, too vivid. She grabbed her coat and left her house, walking into the streets of Ashford, determined to understand why this was happening. The town looked different under the red moonlight, unnervingly so. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The buildings loomed like dark sentinels, and the world felt warped, as if she were walking through a dream. As she passed the town square, she heard the whispers again, those soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to be everywhere, yet nowhere at all. They were calling her, urging her to keep going, to follow the shadows. Her feet carried her toward the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place she had always been told to avoid. It was there, in the cemetery, that the townspeople buried their secrets. And as she approached the old wrought iron gate, she saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, a tall, thin man with a face she could not recognize. But the moment their eyes met, a chill ran through her, and the world around her seemed to shift. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, his voice hollow and distant, like an echo from another time. "But now that you have, there's no going back." Samantha froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man stepped forward, his gaunt figure becoming clearer in the dim light. He was one of them, the ones from her nightmares. His eyes were black, voids of darkness that seemed to swallow everything in their path. The red moon cast an eerie glow on his face, highlighting the sharpness of his features. "Those who are chosen to witness the truth are cursed," he said. "The red moon awakens the past. The things you've seen, the things you've felt, are not dreams, Samantha. They are the echoes of this town's history, the curse that has haunted Ashford for generations." The man's smile stretched wide, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth like jagged stones. "You are not the first to be chosen," he continued, his voice growing colder. "And you won't be the last. We are all bound by the moon's call. The nightmare never ends. It only grows stronger, and soon it will consume you." Samantha took a step back, her mind racing. She knew she had to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. The man's words echoed in her mind, and as she turned to run, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the world tilting and twisting around her. Then the whispers grew louder. They were no longer distant, but surrounding her, closing in. She could hear them now, clearer than ever. "Wake up, Samantha! Wake up, it's too late." Samantha screamed, her vision blurring, her world spinning, and in that moment, she realized the terrible truth. The curse was real. The red moon wasn't just a signal. It was a harbinger, a reminder that Ashford was never meant to forget the horrors of its past. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape. Story 2. The Crawling Shadows. Lily had always prided herself on her independence. She lived alone in a small apartment in the city, and while she had her share of personal struggles, she liked the peace and quiet that came with it. But lately, something had started to unsettle her, something that she couldn't quite explain. It started subtly, almost imperceptible at first. One evening, as she was walking home from work, she noticed the shadows around her seemed to behave differently. The streetlights cast long, jagged shadows, but one of them, just one, seemed to move unnaturally, stretching and bending in a way that didn't match the rest. Lily dismissed it as a trick of the light, too tired to give it much thought. But the next night, it happened again. She was sitting in her living room, flipping through a book, when a strange sensation crawled up her spine. A feeling of being watched. She glanced around the room. Nothing was out of place, but then she noticed it. One of the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift. It stretched unnaturally, almost as though it were alive. Lily blinked, and it was gone. Her heart began to pound. It was late. Maybe she was just exhausted. She had been working long hours at her new job, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But the unease wouldn't leave. It was as though something was there, just out of sight, lurking in the corners of her vision. The following days passed with little fanfare, but the strange occurrences began to escalate. Lily would walk down the hallway of her apartment building, and when she glanced behind her, the shadow at the end of the hall would grow longer, its edges becoming more distorted. At first, she thought it was just the way the light hit the walls, but soon she started to realize that no matter where she went, the shadows followed, and they were getting closer. One night, as she stood by her kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Slowly, she turned her head to the left, where a shadow in the corner of the room seemed to be stretching toward her. It was thick and inky, its shape indistinct, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. It crawled across the floor, inching closer with each passing second. Lily gasped and stumbled back, dropping the knife in her hand. The shadow seemed to pause, as if it were aware of her presence. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from it. She blinked, and the shadow was gone, vanishing into the darkness of the room as if it had never been there. Panic crept in, gnawing at her sanity. She had to get out of this apartment. She had to get away from whatever was following her. But no matter where she went, the shadows seemed to follow. The next day, she couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted. The shadows at work seemed to shift whenever she wasn't looking. They slithered across walls and floors, growing and shrinking as if they were alive, always closing in, always watching. Her once calm existence had become a living nightmare. She couldn't concentrate at work. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel them, creeping, waiting. That night, she did what she thought would make it stop. She turned every light on in her apartment, her lamps, the overhead lights, even the hallway light outside her door. The room was awash in bright light, every corner bathed in illumination. If shadows were just a trick of the dark, surely they couldn't exist in the light. But as the light flooded the room, she saw it. The shadows shifted, as if the light itself were being twisted, stretched, and contorted. In the middle of her living room, a long, thin shadow crept across the floor, elongating like a finger reaching for her. Lily gasped and stepped backward, but as she moved, the shadow followed, and it grew closer, stretching out as if it were alive, its form becoming darker and more distinct, its edges sharp and menacing. Her heart raced as she ran toward the door, but the shadow surged forward, blocking her exit. It was no longer just a shadow. It had taken form, a solid, crawling mass that moved like something alive, like an animal creeping toward its prey. Desperate, Lily grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and swung it at the shadow. The light flickered, but the shadow didn't retreat. It moved around the light, as though it were avoiding it, adapting to the bright surroundings, slithering ever closer to her. Panic consumed her. She backed up against the wall, trembling, but the shadows kept advancing. Her breath quickened. It felt as if the very walls of her apartment were closing in. The shadows surrounded her, and no matter how fast she moved, they were always there, always closer. She screamed, her voice echoing in the small apartment, but no one could hear her. She was alone. In a frantic moment of clarity, she remembered something her grandmother had once told her. If the shadows grow too close, if they start to crawl, you must leave the light. You must go to the place where the shadows can't follow. Lily's mind raced. What did that mean? What place? Without thinking, she bolted toward the bathroom, shutting the door behind her. It was the only room in her apartment that had no windows, no way for the shadows to creep in. She locked the door, trembling with fear. Her breathing was shallow as she sank to the floor, her mind a whirl of confusion and terror. She had escaped them, at least for now. But then she heard it, the scraping sound, the sound of something dragging along the floor, slow and deliberate, as if it were searching for her. She held her breath, the noise growing louder, closer. She pressed her ear against the cold bathroom door, listening to the slow, agonizing scrape. Suddenly, there was a knock, a soft, quiet knock on the bathroom door. She recoiled, fear flooding her veins. The knock came again, but this time it was louder. Story 3. The Silent Phone. Every night at precisely 3 a.m., a phone rings. Its shrill, unsettling tone pierces the silence of the house, waking whoever happens to be within earshot. The phone is old, the kind that still has a rotary dial, sitting on a wooden table in the dimly lit hallway of a decaying house. It hasn't been used in years, or so it seems. No one remembers who owns it. No one remembers when it was last plugged in, and yet every night without fail, it rings. The first few times, the sound is almost easy to ignore. Just a quirk of the house, something unexplainable but harmless. But as the nights stretch on, the ringing becomes harder to dismiss. The caller each time says nothing, no words, no breaths, not even the sound of static, just dead silence, filling the space until it becomes unbearable. And then just as suddenly as it began, the call ends. But then one night, it happens. The phone rings again, but this time, there's a whisper. It's faint, almost imperceptible, as if the person on the other end is standing far away. A breath, a hushed voice that sounds oddly familiar, like a long-forgotten memory creeping to the surface. The words are unclear, but the chill that runs down your spine is unmistakable. The caller is not a stranger. The next night, the phone rings again. This time, the voice is clearer. A name is spoken, your name. A rush of fear floods your body. You know, you haven't given your number to anyone in years. You haven't told a soul about the phone, yet someone is calling, and they know you by name. There's no mistaking it. The voice on the other end isn't just familiar. It's intimate. It's as though they know everything about you. The tone, the rhythm, your every hesitation and pause. The third night, the voice grows stronger, more distinct. You can now hear the inflections in the speech, the subtle quiver of emotion. The voice sounds as if it's coming from the other side of the room, soft but clear. I miss you, it says, a gentle whisper that sends shivers down your spine. It's not just a voice. It's a presence. You know who it is, but you can't place it. It's someone from your past. Someone you haven't thought about in years. Someone you thought was lost forever. It becomes a ritual now. Every night, the phone rings, and every night, the voice grows more familiar. Each conversation leaves you with a lingering sense of déjà vu, as if you've heard this voice 1,000 times before. The tone is comforting, soothing almost, but there's an undeniable sense of dread that accompanies the calls. You can never see who's on the other end. No matter how many times you lift the receiver, there's nothing but an untraceable silence, broken only by those whispered words. One night, the voice speaks with more clarity than ever. "Do you remember me?" it asks, and you feel a flood of memories surge within you. It's as if the voice is drawing on long-buried fragments of your past, pieces of a life you've pushed away. You realize with horror that it's someone you once knew, someone who had died, someone whose funeral you attended, whose grave you visited. The realization is suffocating. The voice continues, now sounding not just familiar, but close. "I've been waiting for you," it says softly, "waiting to come back." Panic sets in, and you drop the phone, your heart pounding in your chest. The room feels colder, the air heavier, but as you stand there, trembling, the phone rings again. Your pulse races. Should you answer it? Can you bear to hear the voice again? You stare at the phone, now an object of dread, a tether to something, or someone, long gone. But something is wrong. As the phone rings for the final time, you realize the most terrifying truth of all. The voice on the other end isn't calling to you from the past. It's calling from the future. You pick up the phone one last time. The voice, now unmistakable, says, "I've been waiting for you to answer. It's time to come home." As you hold the receiver in your trembling hands, the voice on the other end grows quieter, but it is still unmistakably there. Your pulse races, every muscle in your body urging you to hang up, to walk away, but the voice holds you captive, compelling, soothing, yet undeniably chilling. "Come home," the voice repeats, this time with an undertone of sadness that resonates deep within your chest. The words feel like a gentle pull, like a forgotten promise, but you know something is terribly wrong. The voice is familiar, yes, but it's not just someone from your past. There is something else, something darker, hiding beneath the surface. Your mind races, trying to connect the dots, to recall the identity of the person on the other end. It's as though the voice is waiting for you to understand, to realize who it is. But no matter how hard you try, the name doesn't come, and a gnawing sense of dread creeps up your spine. "Who are you?" you manage to whisper into the receiver, your voice barely audible over the pounding of your heart. The silence on the other end stretches, and for a moment it feels as if the world itself has paused. You strain to hear anything, any sound that might give you a clue, but there is nothing, only a hollow, suffocating quiet. Then, as if the voice were standing directly beside you, it speaks again. This time its tone is not one of pleading, but of cold inevitability. "You've forgotten me," it murmurs, a tremor of sorrow lacing the words. "But I remember you. I always have." The truth hits you like a bolt of lightning, sharp, overwhelming, and devastating. The voice, it's your own. You reel back, nearly dropping the phone in shock. But no, it can't be. It must be someone who sounds like you, someone who has been watching you, haunting you. And yet deep down, you know it's impossible to deny. The voice on the other end isn't a stranger, isn't some trickster, it's you. But the version of you that has been lost, the version that never left, the version that died. You stare at the phone, your mind unraveling as the realization settles in. The voice is coming from a time you cannot remember, a place you cannot reach. It is the voice of someone who no longer exists, someone who has been waiting for you. The phone, once a symbol of communication, is now a conduit to something far darker. As you begin to piece together the fragments of your past, flashes of forgotten memories flood your mind. You see a face, but it's blurry, indistinct. You see a scene, a car crash, a dark street at night, a figure standing alone in the rain. You feel the weight of something lost, something tragic, but it's just out of reach. Then the voice returns, soothing yet full of sorrow. "I'm waiting," it whispers. "I've always been waiting." A cold shiver runs down your spine, and you suddenly realize that the phone hasn't been ringing just to speak to you. It's been trying to pull you back, to guide you towards something. The dead, your own reflection from a time you cannot remember, is calling you home. You try to shake the thoughts away, to focus on something, anything that will stop the spiral of fear clawing at your chest. But the voice continues, relentless, piercing through the veil of your uncertainty. "The time is near," it says. "Come home and remember." You close your eyes, trying to block it out, trying to pretend this isn't happening. But it's no use. The voice has already invaded your thoughts, already woven itself into the fabric of your existence. You begin to feel the pull, like a tether to something you can't escape. And as much as you want to fight it, you can't. The voice is your past, your future, and your fate all tangled into one. Then suddenly you hear something new, a faint clicking sound. The phone line crackles, and you swear you hear someone or something breathing heavily on the other end. The voice whispers once more, this time closer, almost as if it were standing just behind you. "You shouldn't have picked up," it says, its tone not sad but almost pleased. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and you turn, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows of the room. But there's nothing. No one is there. "Come home," it repeats. But this time you understand. It's not calling you to return to your old life. It's calling you to embrace the truth of your death, the truth you've been running from all this time. The phone rings no longer out of necessity. It rings because it is the last connection you have to the past, the last thread that binds you to the world you once knew. And as the voice whispers once more, "It's time to come home," you feel your body grow cold, your breath slow, and your mind slip into darkness. The call has finally been answered. "Do you remember now?" the voice asks, its words sharp and taunting. "You never left. I've been here all along." The phone trembles in your hand, as if it has a life of its own. The truth is dawning upon you now. You never left. The life you remember, the life you've lived, is an illusion. You are already gone, and this phone, this cursed connection, has been the only thing keeping you tethered to the living world. With a trembling hand, you try to hang up, but the phone won't budge. It's as if the receiver is glued to your hand, forcing you to listen, forcing you to accept your fate. The voice on the other end grows louder, more insistent, as if it's pulling you towards some unseen force. The house at the edge of the forest. When Clara received the letter, she could hardly believe it. The house, left to her by a grandmother she barely remembered, stood at the edge of a dense, almost impenetrable forest. The house had been in her family for generations, but the details about her grandmother were shrouded in mystery. The letter was the first time Clara had heard of the estate, and it came with strange instructions. Stay out of the forest after dark. The first few days in the house were peaceful. It was a charming old structure, creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. The quiet of the place, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of the occasional bird call, should have been comforting. But as Clara wandered the house, she began to feel the weight of the silence. No one had lived there for a long time. Her grandmother's presence felt distant, almost as if she had never truly existed. The rule, stay out of the forest after dark, echoed in Clara's mind. She dismissed it as an old superstition, a warning passed down through the generations, perhaps out of fear or local legend. The forest loomed just beyond the back porch, its dark canopy seemingly impenetrable. But there was something enticing about it, a mystery that stirred Clara's curiosity. What was so dangerous about it? On the fourth evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara's curiosity got the better of her. She stood at the edge of the forest, the trees whispering in the wind, as if calling her forward. Against her better judgment, she took a step into the shadows. The air grew colder the deeper she walked, and the path became less distinct, as though the forest didn't want her there. She ignored the growing sense of unease and pressed on. It wasn't until the moon rose high in the sky, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor, that Clara realized how far she had gone. The trees were thicker now, and the path was no longer clear. She turned to retrace her steps, but the forest had changed. The trees closed in, the wind howled with an unnatural chill, and Clara felt a sense of being watched. Suddenly, the forest went silent. Her heart raced in her chest as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She stopped dead in her tracks, listening intently. From deep within the trees came a faint rustling sound, like something large moving between the branches. It was too rhythmic to be the wind. Something was out there. Clara's breath hitched as she heard a low, guttural growl, a sound that didn't belong in the woods. The trees trembled, and a figure stepped into the clearing ahead of her. It wasn't human, tall and impossibly thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins that pulsed beneath like twisted roots. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight as it fixed them on Clara with a cold, predatory stare. The creature's mouth was twisted in a grotesque grin, its teeth sharp and yellowed, and a soft, guttural voice rasped from its throat. "You shouldn't have come here." Clara stood frozen, her legs trembling beneath her. The creature took a step forward, its elongated limbs twisting unnaturally. It was like no animal she had ever seen, no human either. It was something ancient, something that had been lurking in the forest, waiting. The creature tilted its head, studying Clara as if it were savoring her fear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the trees. Clara's breath came in quick gasps as she stumbled backward, fear clenching her chest. She turned and ran, not daring to look back. The sound of the creature's footsteps echoed in the distance, following her every move. But when Clara finally burst into the clearing near the house, she realized something even more disturbing. The forest had changed. The trees were different, their trunks thicker, their branches twisted and gnarled. The path that had once led her back to the house was now gone, replaced by a labyrinth of dark, shadowy woods. The house at the edge of the forest was still there, but it felt further away than it had before, as though the forest itself was pulling her deeper into its grasp. Clara slammed the door behind her, locking it, her heart racing. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't the only thing lurking in the woods. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of the wind howling through the trees growing louder, more insistent. Clara tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but every creak of the house, every rustling of the leaves outside, made her jump. As the hours passed, Clara couldn't help but feel the weight of the house pressing down on her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting outside, just beyond the walls. and in the back of her mind, she heard the same whisper that had come from the creature. You shouldn't have come here. Clara couldn't escape the house. No matter how many windows she checked, how many doors she tried to open, the forest had grown closer. She felt the pull of something ancient, something malevolent, and she realized that she was no longer just on the edge of the forest. The forest was inside her now, and as the moon rose higher in the sky, Clara heard the faintest sound, something scratching at the door. It was the same low growl she had heard in the woods. The creature had come back, but this time it wasn't alone. The sound of more footsteps, smaller ones, echoed outside the door. Clara's heart sank. She wasn't alone anymore. The scratching at the door grew louder, followed by a low, guttural whisper. Clara pressed her back to the wall, her breath shallow. She could feel the eyes of the forest on her, creeping closer and closer. And then from outside came the voice, soft and cold. We're waiting. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore. Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.